welcome to Tools for Managing Stress and Burnout. So as mentioned throughout the workshop, I also want to acknowledge that you all come to this workshop, this webinar with your own set of experience, your own set of skills, your own set of wisdom. So at any point, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. And if you have any sort of questions that are lingering in your mind and you're sort of, dismissing them or being like, no, I don't need to ask that question, it's not really that important, I really do encourage you to ask that question, because oftentimes if you have a question like that, other folks do as well. And we can learn a lot even from the questions that folks ask during these webinars. So thanks again for being here. And as mentioned, I've been working with the Crisis Center since 2017, and I really love what I do. So thank you for being here with me and giving me an opportunity to do what I do. And I wanted to start off today with a quote, just because of all of that's going on in the world. It's probably impacting each and every one of us in a variety of ways. So this is a quote that I've come across recently that I really appreciate. So although the world is full of suffering, it is also full of overcoming of it, by Helen Keller. So just something to sit with as we begin our day today. So what we're going to do today together is we're going to go over some mindfulness-based tools that can support well-being. I'm going to provide you with a definition of mindfulness that I like to use so that we can all be on the same page, because my assumption is that mindfulness is a word that many of us have heard. And what is it? What exactly is going on in our physiology and in our bodies and in our brains and in our spirits when we're practicing mindfulness? So we're going to talk more about that. We're going to talk more about how and why these tools can help us support preventing burnout and managing stress. And we're going to go over some practical exercises that we can use each and every day to support us, because as we're going to talk about, mindfulness really is a practice. And so let's start off by talking about what mindfulness is. So the language that I like to use around what mindfulness is that mindfulness is our ability to intentionally pay attention to one thing for an extended period of time without judgment. And so that one thing that we intentionally pay attention to can be a variety of things, and we can get incredibly creative with it. So oftentimes we think of mindfulness as noticing our breathing or noticing the sounds we can hear. And yeah, that's definitely a part of it. And that might work really well for some folks. We're intentionally paying attention to one thing, like the breath, for an extended period of time without judgment, or when we intentionally pay attention to our sense of hearing, if that's accessible to us, for an extended period of time without judgment, or bringing our attention to the present moment. And we're going to talk more about how that supports our physiology and how that can support us in preventing burnout and managing stress over time as we practice this. So I encourage you to get creative and curious and think about different ways where you might be intentionally paying attention to one thing for an extended period of time without judgment, hopefully throughout your day, knowing that mindfulness can look like a lot of different things, and we can get very creative with it, as I mentioned. And so sometimes people have this idea that mindfulness is about having no thoughts or, being calm all the time. And I like to offer an alternative to that, where mindfulness is developing our capacity to witness what's happening in the moment, regardless of what's happening, so that we can then choose how we want to respond to that, rather than just going into that reactionary mode. So we're going to talk more about that too today. So let's continue by talking a little bit about the science of mindfulness-based tools, so we can have a deeper understanding of what's happening in our physiology when we practice mindfulness, when we practice paying attention intentionally to one thing for an extended period of time without judgment. So we'll start off by talking about one way of understanding well-being and stress. And so one way of understanding well-being and stress is with this idea of a window of tolerance. And this is a term that was coined by Dr. Dan Siegel and Dr. Pat Ogden in the 90s. And they both do a lot of work around the biology of human connection and what happens when we have optimal moments of connection and what happens when we don't have optimal moments of connection. And this is a term that's gaining a lot of popularity these days. So some of this information might be new for you, and some of this might be information that you're revisiting. And it can be really helpful to revisit this information from time to time, because especially when we're processing what life throws our way, it can take practice to support ourselves as we go through the stressors of life. So back to this idea of a window of tolerance. This window of tolerance suggests that we all have a certain window of tolerance. We all have a certain capacity where we're able to stay curious, we're able to stay mindful, we're able to stay capable of handling what's happening in front of us without feeling overwhelmed by it. And within our window of tolerance, it doesn't mean that we feel fine all the time. It means that we feel capable of responding thoughtfully to what's happening without feeling overwhelmed or without going into those reactionary modes. So within our window of tolerance, we can feel angry, we can feel frustrated, we can feel sad, we can feel depressed, we can feel happy and joyful and curious. And if we get a sense of like, yeah, okay, the situation might be hard, it might be challenging, and I got this. I can thoughtfully respond to the situation rather than just react to it. We can think of that as when we're in our window of tolerance. And our window of tolerance, we can think of it like a container. And our container grows and shrinks throughout our whole lives. So it's not a fixed size thing. So, depending on the level of support and self care and community care and community involvement we have in our lives, these things support growing our window of tolerance so that we have capacity to stay present to what's happening without feeling overwhelmed by it. And when there's ongoing stress in our lives and not enough support to keep up with that level of stress, it's a normal biological response that our window of tolerance is going to shrink over time, thus causing us to feel overwhelmed more easily or to go into states of higher levels of stress or feeling out of control more easily. And like I said, our window of tolerance grows and shrinks throughout our whole lives. So, for example, if you're noticing that your own capacity, your own window of tolerance is less than it was before the pandemic, so you're noticing that your capacity to handle what life is throwing your way feels like it's less than it was, let's say, 5 years ago. That's a perfectly normal response to ongoing stress. So, when there's ongoing stress in our lives and not enough support to keep up with that level of stress, our window of tolerance is going to shrink, thus causing us to go into states of what we call hyper arousal or hypoarousal a little bit more easily. And we can continue to grow our window of tolerance by practicing different mindfulness exercises and taking care of ourselves and connecting with our loved ones and doing the things that we know support us, like staying hydrated. Getting our basic human needs met is a really important piece of supporting our window of tolerance. So we want to be gentle with ourselves. If we're recognizing that our own capacity to handle what life is throwing our way is less than it was a few years ago, I encourage you to be gentle with yourself, knowing that that's a perfectly normal biological response to ongoing stress. And I'm just going to take a moment here to tune into the chat. Sarah's mentioning, I've heard it said when you're doing the dishes, just do the dishes. Yep, absolutely. So when we're thinking of supporting ourselves with mindfulness, it's just really about paying attention to what's happening in front of us, tuning into our senses, and doing the dishes is my assumption is that most of us do that on a daily basis. So it's a daily way to practice a little bit of mindfulness in our days rather than thinking of it as something else that we have to add to our to-do list. We can find creative ways of intentionally paying attention to our senses, to that one thing, like our sense of sight or smell or taste or touch or hearing, whatever is most accessible to us, to support us in coming back to being more present and to coming back to our window of tolerance. And then it's also perfectly normal for us to get taken out of our window of tolerance. It's going to happen to all of us, sometimes each and every day. It's part of being human. And when we get taken out of our window of tolerance, when we start to feel overwhelmed by something, or our stress levels start to take over and start running the show, we go into states of what we call hyperarousal or hypoarousal, or a little bit of both. It's not necessarily one or the other. And in that state of hyperarousal, we can think of this as when our defenses of flight, fight, and freeze are running the show. So our autonomic nervous system responses are saying, hey, I think we're in danger, so we've got to flight, fight, and freeze in order to stay safe. We might notice more fear or terror or rage or hypervigilance in our behavior and in our emotional states. We might notice more impulsivity in a negative way. We might notice more intrusive thoughts. And it can be really helpful for us to learn to recognize where we might be in our window of tolerance or outside of our window of tolerance. And one way of learning to recognize when we might be in that hyper aroused state is by recognizing what types of thoughts we're having. So if we notice we have a lot of like ruminating thoughts or racing thoughts that feel like they're going a million miles a minute, or I feel thoughts around like I'm not safe, I can't trust anyone, I got to get out of here, I have to run away from the situation. So thoughts around flighting, fighting, or freezing, we can have kind of no thoughts happening sometimes. We can learn to recognize what types of thoughts we're having and get curious with ourselves and say, I'm noticing I'm having a lot of like racing thoughts or ruminating thoughts today. I wonder if my stress levels are a little bit higher. What do I need to do to support myself in this state? And even though it can be highly unpleasant to experience that state of hyperarousal, it fundamentally serves a biological purpose of, letting us know that our biology is basically saying, hey, I think we're in danger right now. So we've got to flight, fight, or freeze in order to stay safe. So again, it's a normal biological response to feeling overwhelmed, to feeling higher levels of stress, and it's our defense system kicking in. So it's part of being human. I'm just going to tune into the chat here again. Rita's wondering if this presentation is being recorded. Yep, it is being recorded from my understanding. And we might also go into a state of what we call hypoarousal. And that state of hypoarousal is when our defenses of shutting down and submitting to what's happening is kind of running the show. So an analogy that I kind of appreciate is there's this film called Inside Out, where it was an animation and the main character's different emotional states were kind of driving the show in her internal world. So we can think of it this way as when we're starting to recognize whether our flight, fight, and freeze or shut down and submitting responses are kind of driving our internal car, so to speak. We can learn to recognize who's at the wheel. And when this hypoaroused state is at the wheel, we might notice we've got more of a flat affect. So meaning we have less access to our emotional responses, or noticing that our emotional responses are quite monotone. We might feel more numb or not really there. We might feel like we're physically present in a room, but cognitively we're kind of somewhere else, or psychologically we're kind of somewhere else. We might be preoccupied with shame or despair or depression when that hypoaroused state is running the show. Our cognitive functioning is often slowed down, so we might not have as much access to our words as we normally have, or to thinking as quickly as we normally like to be thinking. I put the word lazy in quotes because sometimes we can use a lot of, like judgmental language around our behaviors or the behaviors of other people. And I like to put lazy in quotes here because when we catch ourselves using these types of words like lazy or unmotivated, whether it's for ourselves or for other people, I like to invite some curiosity there, where instead of using that type of language, we can get curious and wonder what state this person's physiology is in. And imagine if somebody's like chronically in that state of hypoarousal, it would make sense that they don't have a lot of energy left to do a lot of the things they might want to be doing during the day, or to find the motivation to do the things that they want to be doing, because their physiology is so focused on supporting their survival by either shutting down or that flight, fight, and freeze response, or whatever might be happening for that person. So when we use that type of language like lazy or unmotivated or whatever other words we've sort of thrown at ourselves or at other people, we can kind of shift that lens to some curiosity and wonder what might be happening in that person's internal state. And some types of thoughts that we can learn to recognize within ourselves when that hypoaroused state is running the show it could be things like, I'm worthless, I'm helpless, I'm hopeless, there's nothing I can do here. So again, even though it can be highly unpleasant to experience this hypoaroused state, it serves a biological purpose of supporting our survival. So there's nothing wrong with us for going into these states. It's a normal biological response to stress. Tap into the Q&A here. Can you elaborate the meaning of freezing action in hyperaroused state? Yep. And so when we're freezing, in one sense, one way of understanding this is that our primary line of defense is to flight from a situation, to run away from a situation. If we can't run away from the situation, our biology is going to want to fight the situation. And if for whatever reason we can't fight the situation, our physiology is going to start to freeze because it's so overwhelmed. They can't kind of handle all the energy that's happening inside of it. And it goes into a freeze response. And we can think of a freeze response as kind of like the word literally, where the person might feel more frozen, more constricted in their body, losing access, like our thoughts might start to freeze a little bit and we forget our words or we lose access to our words. A common description of this freeze response is kind of like deer in the headlights. When we're driving and we see a deer and the deer sort of freezes in our headlights. That's kind of one way of understanding that freeze response is it's our biology's way of kind of feeling so overwhelmed that it doesn't know what to do, that it'll like literally freeze in a sense of becoming quite rigid, quite frozen, and quite stuck and not able to flight or fight the situation. Yeah, great questions, folks. And in the chat, there's a couple of pieces coming up. Deer in the headlights, exactly. Yeah. Sarah's mentioning, I also dislike the word lazy. Thank you for saying that. You're welcome. Yeah, we can invite a lot of curiosity when we start to understand our physiologies a little bit more and how this happens to each and every one of us. And ideally, we have, flexible physiologies that are able to go in and out of all of these states as needed. And we can think of states of distress or when people sometimes chronically live in these states of hyperarousal and hypoarousal, and their capacity to bounce out of them, to kind of bounce back to their window of tolerance, is compromised for a variety of reasons. So, unfortunately, some people do live in these states of hyper and hypoarousal. So as we talked about before, one thing that really supports us in coming back to our window of tolerance and growing our window of tolerance is getting our basic human needs met. And so if our basic human needs aren't getting met, it makes perfect biological sense that we'd be reacting to that with these hyperaroused and hypoaroused states. So it can be really helpful to learn to recognize these different states. And we've already started talking about different ways of recognizing these internal states so that we can know how to better take care of ourselves. And some ways of recognizing those internal states were with recognizing what types of thoughts we're having. And another way could be some of these things that are listed here. And I also want to highlight that just because these things are listed here as a stress response, it doesn't automatically mean that it's because of stress that they're happening. So we want to get curious when we start to notice things like more difficulty concentrating or higher levels of anxiety or depression or irritability, because it could be from a stress response and it could be from other things as well. So we want to get curious when we start to recognize these different types of responses happening. We might notice changes in our moods. We might notice more of a mind fog when we're feeling a higher level of stress. So like I know for myself, I've learned to recognize mind fog as a bit of a cue when my stress response is running the show, where my vision starts to look 2D and I start to lose access to my words and things start to feel a bit foggy. So I've learned to recognize that, and now I can, let myself know like, hey, okay, I'm noticing my stress response is elevated. What do I need to do to support myself? How do I want to proceed thoughtfully rather than just having the stress response take over? We might notice changes in our cardiovascular systems, changes in our joints and our muscles. Like I'm sure that many of us can relate to either having headaches or tension in our jaw or tension in our stomachs or our shoulders or our necks when we're feeling more stress. Like, sometimes it's our ears hurt, like stress can show up in all kinds of ways. It can affect our vocal cords. So some people can lose their voice a little bit when they're stressed out. So again, recognizing this can support us in figuring out how do we want to take care of ourselves when we're noticing that we've got higher levels of stress going on. It can change our immune system functioning. It can change our skin tone. So an example of that could be, have you ever noticed like when somebody's really in that fight mode, we might start to see it in their face, like their pupils can dilate, their skin might turn really red, and you can really see the anger in their face. Sometimes people start to snarl like an animal a little bit when they're really in that fight mode, because that fight mode is a very primal part of the brain, like a very animal-esque part of the brain. So that snarl response can be something that happens for some people. We might notice changes in our digestive systems. And so one theory as to why that's happening is that our biology, our bodies only have a certain amount of energy to use. And when the energy needs to go to that survival response, to that stress response, Our biology is on one level saying, I don't need to spend the energy digesting my food right now in order to survive. I need to fight, fight, freeze, or shut down in order to survive. So this part slows down a little bit or speeds up or changes on some level, and the energy goes to that survival response. You might notice changes in our reproductive systems, changes in our hormones, changes in our libidos, changes in our PMS symptoms, changes in our menstrual cycles. So again, we want to get curious when we start to notice these cues that our bodies are giving us, and we want to learn to tune into those cues that our bodies are giving us. And so what we'll do next is I'll talk to you about 3 different parts of the brain, and then I'll use my hand to make a model of the brain, and then we'll do some practicing together of different mindfulness activities that we can do each and every day, along with doing the dishes. I'm just going to have some water here. So the first part of the brain that I'll talk to you about is a part called your amygdala. And this is the little lit up almond shaped part of the brain that's highlighted in the image there. And you've actually got 2 of them. And one of its jobs is to help detect danger. So it has a variety of jobs, and one of them is to detect danger. So you can think of it as kind of like the smoke alarm of your brain, where similar to the smoke alarm in a house, its job is to constantly scan the environment, making sure that you're safe. And when it detects danger, it'll go into the reactionary defensive mode, and it'll basically say, hey, I think we're in danger. So we've got to fight, fight, freeze, or shut down in order to stay safe. Stress hormones get released that are fundamentally designed to keep us safe. So when that amygdala goes off and activates that fight, fight, freeze, and shut down response, this is part of our autonomic nervous system. Stress hormones get released. We go into that reactionary mode rather than being able to thoughtfully respond to what's happening in front of us, rather than being in our window of tolerance and being able to say, hey, yeah, the situation might be tough, and here's how I want to thoughtfully proceed in this situation. We go into that very reactionary. And again, even though it can be highly unpleasant to experience, it's a normal biological response. And we're kind of literally in that survival state. And then there's a third part of the brain that I'll speak about today, which is our prefrontal cortex. And it's just behind our foreheads. And it's a part of our brain that finishes developing on average in our mid-20s. So for some folks younger, for some folks a bit older. So the part of our brain that helps to regulate our internal states, that basically helps to give that amygdala a little bit of a hug, that helps to modify that fear response, that helps with flexibility in thinking, that helps us to see the bigger picture and to think of future consequences to past behaviors. This part of our brain finishes developing when we're a little bit older. So we want to remind ourselves of that too when we're, if you have little ones or you work with little ones, that the parts of our brain that help to regulate our internal states and to help with flexibility in thinking and seeing the bigger picture, our developmental capacity to do that is actually when we're, much older than we sometimes think. So we want to approach our little ones with kind of recognizing where they're at developmentally and knowing that they're having these really big emotions in their little bodies sometimes, and their capacity to regulate their internal states isn't fully developed yet. So our own ability to stay in what we're going to call our whole brain state can support offering some of that co-regulation piece. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my hand to make a model of some of this information so we can have a visual understanding of these words that I'm throwing your way. So my palm is going to represent a very old part of our brain, and it's responsible for things that we don't have to consciously think about doing. So things like breathing, or our heart rates, or digesting our food, or that fight, fight, freeze, and shut down response. These are all things that we do without having to consciously choose to do them. So we don't consciously choose to go into that fight, fight, and freeze and shut down response. It's our biology's way of supporting our survival. And then my thumb folding over my palm is going to represent that amygdala. So that amygdala, one of its roles is to help you detect danger, like a smoke alarm. So it'll constantly scan the environment. And when it does detect danger, it'll send a signal to the palm part of the brain. And it'll say, hey, right now I think we're in danger. So we've got to fight, fight, freeze, or shut down in order to stay safe. And the whole thing happens really, really quick. So my assumption too is that, if I asked you folks, like how many of you have ever like, all of a sudden had a fight and you don't know what you're fighting about, or you start to escalate with somebody else because they're escalated, we can kind of start to recognize that it can happen really quick that our amygdalas go off. And then that third part of the brain that I spoke about is our prefrontal cortex, which is represented by my fingers folding over my thumb. So when the whole brain is working kind of all together, which is going to look different for each and every one of us. So what our whole brains look like, how my brain functions is going to be a little bit different than how your brain functions. And that's perfectly normal as humans. We all function a little bit differently, and that's okay. And so what happens when that amygdala goes off is that if there's a strong connection from this part of the brain to this part of the brain, instead of the amygdala sending a signal to the palm part of the brain, this prefrontal cortex can kick in and it can say, like, yeah, the situation sucks and we got this. We can figure out a different way to handle the situation rather than, kind of what we'll call like flip our lids, lose connection to this part of our brains, and have our amygdalas take over. And mindfulness, one of the things that it does is that it supports us in strengthening the connections from this part of the brain to this part of the brain so that we have more capacity to bounce back to our whole brain states, to our window of tolerances, so that we can choose how we want to respond to what's happening and so that we can support our well-being from that place. So I'm going to put my hand down for a moment and tune into the Q&As. Yep, so there's going to be copies of this recording available for everybody. And then a couple of comments coming up in the chat. Yep, sweet, thanks folks. And so let's move ahead a little bit. So the first tool that I'll invite us to practice together, if you feel like joining me, is something called the stop tool. And so again, we can get really creative with these things. And so with all of the practices that we're about to do, I invite you to get curious about whether you like them or not. Either way, it doesn't really matter. We can get very creative with mindfulness practices, and these are some things that we can do to support our well-being. So feel free to take pieces from them. Feel free to take all of them, put them in your pockets for a future date. And I really want to highlight here the word practice. So we often hear, mindfulness practices. And we can often be quite hard on ourselves when we do start to recognize that our stress response is taken over and we start to flip our lids a little bit. We can get a bit frustrated with ourselves and wonder like, I do all these like grounding exercise and all these practices and I'm still like flipping my lid a little bit or, having a really big reaction. And we want to remind ourselves that it takes practice to strengthen the connections from this part of the brain to this part of the brain. And it takes ongoing kind of consistent practice. So we could think of it kind of like similar to diet and exercise, where, like unfortunately, the one jog that I went on when I was a teenager isn't going to keep me in shape for the rest of my life. Like I have to keep continuously exercising in order to support that physiological well-being. We can think of mindfulness similarly, where we need to kind of practice it consistently, even for a few, seconds or moments each and every day to support us as we go, rather than thinking of it as like a one-time thing and then we're done. So back to the stop tool. So stop is a handy little acronym that stands for stop, take a breath, observe internally and externally without judgment. So observing, intentionally paying attention to what's going on for us through any of our senses, whatever works for us, or noticing the external worlds. And then this allows us to proceed a little bit more thoughtfully. So I'll talk to you about the stop practice for another moment or two. And then I'll invite you to join me in a practice if you feel like it. And then we'll move ahead. So fundamentally, what we're doing when we're taking a moment to stop, take a breath, and this can be as organic as possible. There's really no one right way to practice this. There's no wrong way to practice this either. So I really want to highlight that. Because for some of us, when we do these types of practices, we can get very, caught up in our minds and wonder, am I doing this right? Am I doing it perfectly? All the types of thoughts we might be having around this. And I encourage you to recognize them and gently let them go, knowing that there is no right or wrong way to practice this. And we can kind of practice it with some curiosity. So when we stop and take a breath and observe internally, what that could mean is noticing how we're feeling, or noticing, our posture, noticing if there's any wiggle that wants to come out in our bodies, noticing what parts of our body are touching the chair underneath us, kind of intentionally noticing some of those things as examples. We can observe externally, so noticing what we can see in the room around us, if that's accessible to us, or intentionally noticing the sounds we can hear, if that's accessible to us, or intentionally like touching something, or smelling something, or tasting something. And when we observe internally and externally, what we're doing is we're, one, strengthening the connections from this part of the brain to this part of the brain. And we're allowing some time for that whole brain state to kind of come back online so that we can proceed more thoughtfully from this place. And we can respond to, is it helpful to me? Is this helpful to others? Is it helpful to the planet? What matters most right now? Rather than kind of what we called, flipping our lids and having our fight, freeze, and shut down responses running the show. So the stop practice is one way to support ourselves when we're noticing that stress response is elevating. And then we can kind of practice a tool like stop to support us in settling some of that stress response. So I think of it kind of like a pre-programmed package where our biology knows it's going to go into that survival response from time to time. So it's given us this like innate tool of mindfulness to support us in coming out of that state and to support us and our well-being over time. So if you feel like joining me in this moment, I'm going to do a short mindfulness practice of stop to kind of, the more we practice when it's easy to practice, the easier it can become over time. And especially when we find ourselves in states of higher levels of stress, we can kind of forget about the skills we have along the way. So the more we practice a tool like stop, when it's easy to practice, we help build up that muscle so that we have a stronger practice for when things start to get challenging. So if you feel like joining me, please do. If you feel like just listening, please do. And if you feel like doing your own thing, please feel free to do that as well. So in this moment, just stopping, just noticing if, my shoulders want to move a little. Some movement wants to happen. We sit a lot in our days. We spend a lot of time on our computers. It can be helpful to tune in every so often. And just take a breath. Remembering there's no right or wrong way to do that. O is that observe internally piece and externally. So just maybe noticing what your feet are doing. Noticing what your hands are doing. And there's no need to change anything or correct anything. It's just about noticing. If you like, and if it's accessible to you, you can look around the room a little bit and bring some attention intentionally to your sense of sight. Just noticing how the light hits the wall. Some art on your wall or some plants. Whatever you're noticing is okay. You might notice that your mind has wandered a million times to thinking about what you've got to do later and what that embarrassing thing you said yesterday. And I invite you to just gently bring your attention intentionally back to looking around the room, or maybe noticing what you can hear. And then for proceeding thoughtfully in this moment, I'll invite you to just take a moment to notice what that was like for you to practice that if you were joining me. Maybe notice what the quality of your attention is like now. If it's the same, great. If it's different, just noticing. And remembering that the more we practice these types of tools, the stronger that muscle gets. So when we find ourselves starting to escalate or with higher levels of stress, We've got more capacity to stop, take a breath, observe internally and externally without judgment, so that we can then proceed more thoughtfully. And these tools sound like relatively simple tools to do, and the tricky part can be remembering to do them. So I often encourage folks to practice as much as we can. And before I talk a little bit more about the practice, I'm just going to tune into the chat here. I need to do more practicing. Totally, yeah. And we can get really playful with it. So I encourage folks to get creative and see what works for them and what doesn't. And a question coming up in the Q&A is, what if we do stop mindfulness exercises with our eyes closed without observation of the surrounding? Yep, that's fine too. We can notice the sounds we can hear. We can notice our breathing. So my suggestion of looking around the room was a suggestion of one way to tune into our senses. And fundamentally, we can tune into any of our senses, whichever one feels the easiest for us to tune into. It could be noticing what we smell, or noticing what we can taste, or noticing what we can touch or hear. All of those things work the same way that connecting to our sense of sight does. Yeah, great question. And I, again, want to highlight that it takes practice. So this is a sort of a common saying these days of neurons that fire together, wire together. So the more we practice intentionally paying attention to that one thing for an extended period of time without judgment, the more that those neurons in our brain, so neurons being like different ways messages get sent across our brains, the more that we practice something, the stronger that gets. So for example, if any of you play an instrument or you play a sport or you drive a car, at first when you learn the instrument or you learn to drive the car, you kind of have no idea what you're doing. And you're like, okay, how do I do this? What do I do here? And then you learn some new skills. And then you practice. And then it kind of becomes like second nature, where we can think of mindfulness as similar to that, where at first it can feel weird, it can feel clunky, where like, I have no idea what I'm doing. Am I doing this right? And we start having all kinds of thoughts around it. And then the more we practice, the easier it can become over time. And part of that is the nature of practicing. And part of that is that our physiology starts to get stronger and has more capacity to do that thing that we've been practicing over time, which is why I really emphasize that mindfulness is a practice piece and so those neurons that fire together, wire together. So the more we practice, those neurons that communicate from here to here get stronger and stronger and stronger over time. And so another way to practice some mindfulness is with something called mitigating the negativity bias. So along with our flight, fight, and freeze and shutdown response that we all have, we have something in us called the negativity bias, which is the phenomenon of giving more psychological weight to bad experiences than to good ones. So on a biological level, one of the theories as to why this is happening is that if we store the information from a negative experience in a deeper part of our memory, this supports us in being more prepared for it the next time that it happens. And a positive experience, our physiology is like, well, that was great, and I don't need to store the information from that experience in order to survive it the next time. So many of you might be, able to resonate with the experience of, those negative things that happen to us in our lives. They can get really sticky, right? They can feel like we start to ruminate about the negative comment that somebody made about us, even though 10 people said really nice things. Or we ruminate about the negative thing that we said or we did, and we ignore all of the good things that we've been doing or all of the positive things that we do. And that negativity bias can take its toll on us, right? And especially when we're thinking of taking care of ourselves and managing stress, we really also want to keep this negativity bias balanced a little bit. And I'm just going to tune into the chat here before I continue. Raquel, yep, thank you. So if we think of the negativity bias like a scale, research suggests that it can take 3 positive interactions to outweigh 1 negative interaction. So that's how heavy the negativity bias can be. And ideally, we have the scale balanced so that the negative experiences aren't weighing so heavily on us. And to keep that scale balanced, we're going to talk a little bit more how to do that, and we're going to practice doing that. Because ideally, with that scale balanced, it's about acknowledging that kind of both of those things are existing. While yes, there's a lot of negative things happening in our days, and in the world right now. We can also recognize what's going well or what's going easily, or moments where we feel safe or moments where we feel content. And when we intentionally notice those moments, we add a little bit of weight to that positive side of the scale so that the scale can stay more balanced. Because as many of you probably know, when that negativity bias or that negative side of the scale starts to get really, really heavy, it can start to change how we feel about ourselves, how we feel about the world. It can change our states of wellness. So ideally, we keep that scale balanced. So our second tool for today is to balance out that scale a little bit. And this is a quote from Rick Hansen that I really appreciate that says, "The brain is like Velcro for negative experiences and Teflon for positive experiences." And so what that means is our brain, like I mentioned, likes to store those negative experiences like Velcro. They can get really sticky inside of us. And a positive experience slides kind of in and out of us like Teflon, like a non-stick pan. And part of that is our biological way of supporting our survival. So again, we want to be gentle with ourselves if we notice that we often focus on the negative or we have a hard time tuning into the positive experiences. I encourage you to be gentle with yourself, knowing that it can be really challenging to be human sometimes. And we've got a lot of our physiology that wants to support our survival that can be sometimes hard to do. So, one way to mitigate the negativity bias is, again, to bring some intentionality to our days. And so, I'll talk about it for a moment here, and then I'll invite you again to practice this with me if you like. And then we'll move ahead to our third tool, and then we'll almost be done. So, one way of mitigating the negativity bias and to add some weight to that positive side of the scale so that it can be more balanced is to intentionally notice moments that we think are good or that are going easily for us, or moments that are feeling gentle, or moments where we feel safe, or moments where we feel grateful for something. And if we can intentionally acknowledge those moments for as little as 20 to 30 seconds, this can support us in adding some weight to that positive side of the scale. And like many things we've been talking about today, it can take practice. So I encourage you in this moment, kind of just in your mind, to bring some attention to recognizing in this moment, perhaps, hopefully, if this is a gentle moment for you, or if this is an easy moment for you, or if this is a good moment for you, and to bring it into your mind, into your experience, and to kind of stay with it, to sort of like breathe it in and soak it up a little bit for as little as 30 seconds. So it's not a very long time. And if you're having trouble kind of noticing something right now in this moment that's feeling easy or gentle, maybe bring to mind something that happened to you today or yesterday where it felt easy for you, or it felt gentle, or you felt content. And it doesn't have to be anything big. It can be like enjoying the cup of coffee that you had this morning, or enjoying your breakfast, or feeling grateful that you had a breakfast to have this morning, or feeling grateful for the comfortable shoes that you get to wear because you stand on your feet a lot for work. And I invite you to just bring to mind one of those moments and kind of breathe it in. And just recognizing this moment here. Notice what it's like for you to bring to mind one of these moments, something that's easy or gentle or good. Knowing that even thinking about those moments can have an impact on our physiology and can support us in settling some of those internal sparkles that might be happening. And it doesn't take very long, as little as 20 or 30 seconds. So I encourage you to find ways to bring that into your day. Maybe, even every couple of hours, just kind of remember to notice something that was good or easy or gentle about the previous hour or about the moment that you're experiencing right now. And to intentionally notice it to support our well-being. And another tool for ourselves today is self-compassion. So I like to start off with a quote that I like on like kind of what is self-compassion, because it's a term that I'm sure a lot of us have heard. So one way of understanding self-compassion is with this quote from Dr. Kristen Neff. And they mention self-compassion is a practice of goodwill, not good feelings. So with self-compassion, we mindfully accept that the moment is painful and embrace ourselves with kindness and care in response, remembering that imperfection is part of the shared human experience. So I want to highlight here, my interpretation of this is that self-compassion isn't always about feeling good. It's about reminding ourselves that being human is hard sometimes. And can we give ourselves a little bit of compassion as we go through this journey of life together? So some things that we can say to ourselves in moments when we're finding ourselves really challenged or really sticky in those flight, fight, and freeze responses or those shutdown responses. And some things we can say to ourselves to settle some of those internal sparkles could be things like, this is a moment of suffering. So reminding ourselves that suffering comes and goes. It's part of the human experience. And it doesn't have to be like all of the human experience. So we can recognize this as a really challenging moment in time. We can remind ourselves of our common humanity, that we all struggle at some point in our lives. We all feel stress, we all feel anger, we all feel sadness, we all feel frustration. We can remind ourselves to be patient with ourselves, that sometimes managing stress also takes time. Right? So we can do these mindfulness skills, these tips and tricks and practice along the way. And some phases in life will be more stressful than others, and it can take more practice than other times to support ourselves in settling some of those sparkles. And we also want to remind ourselves that we're not alone. Right? So we're not alone with our sufferings. We're not alone with our experiences as human beings. Sometimes our suffering experiences can cause us to think that we might be the only ones suffering from that, or that we can't talk to anybody about our sufferings. And I really like to highlight this last one where none of us are alone. And it's okay to reach out and to talk about our sufferings and to acknowledge our common humanity and the fact that we're going to have easy moments in life, we're going to have challenging moments in life, and we're going to have all kinds of moments in between. And we can do things to support ourselves along the way. And we can do things to support each other along the way as well. And this is another quote that I thought would be a nice way to start kind of ending our time together today, from Alison Escalante. And so she mentions, it's time we start valuing the incredible capacity of our biology to find a way in hard times. So while yes, it can be really challenging to deal with these states of hyperarousal and hypoarousal and those higher levels of stress, it's fundamentally our biology's way of trying to let us know what's going on internally so that we can support our well-being and we can support our common humanity. And I also want to highlight that sometimes, these mindfulness tools, these mindfulness tips and tricks that we do feel, supportive. And sometimes we feel like we need more. Sometimes we feel like we need to reach out to other people. And sometimes we don't know who to reach out to. So I want to take a moment here to highlight some of the crisis lines that are available for everybody 24/7. And I want to take a moment to highlight the new Canada-wide 988 number. So how this number works is that you can call it from anywhere in Canada, and you can reach out for support, and no problem is too big or too small. So I encourage you to recognize that you too are worthy of calling these numbers. They really are for everybody. And when you call 988 from, let's say, here in Vancouver, where I'm located, it'll connect you to the 1-800-SUICIDE line, which is the BC Crisis Center. There's also some online chat services if folks prefer to type rather than to talk on the phone. And we try to make support as accessible as possible. There's also a couple of other crisis lines across the province that are geared towards if people want to talk to specific people, there's that as well. So I encourage you to learn a little bit more about the crisis lines, because when we're talking about wellness and support, it's really important to reach out for support as well. And sometimes we don't know who to do that with. And so these numbers really are for everybody. There's also other types of trainings. If you'd like more information on suicide response trainings, crisis response trainings, or other wellness and resiliency trainings, those are also offered through the BC Crisis Center that are available for everybody. There's also workshops geared for you, if that's something that you think could be support in your world. There's also suicide grief support. So I want to highlight here there's suicide bereavement support groups as well, because not everybody knows about those offerings in our communities. And it's really important to reach out for support um, on many levels, including suicide grief support. So I encourage you to reach out to the center if you've got any more questions about any of that. And I wanted to summarize a little bit of our session today before I take some time to answer any more questions or comments or curiosities that might be coming up. Where in today's session, we had an opportunity to talk about the science and stress of well-being. We went over the idea of a window of tolerance and kind of used the hand to make a model of the brain to have an understanding of what happens when we flip our lids and what happens when we come back to being able to proceed more thoughtfully. And we went over 3 different tools of ways to support us in being able to proceed more thoughtfully and settle some of those internal sparkles. So we went over the stop tool. We talked about mitigating the negativity bias, and we talked about the importance of self-compassion and fundamentally compassion for everybody on this planet, knowing that it's not always easy to be human. So I want to say thank you for joining me. Thank you for being curious and open to being here. And hopefully you picked up a couple of tips and tricks along the way. And again, I just want to highlight the importance of practice. So I encourage you to practice with curiosity, with some playfulness, knowing that mindfulness doesn't have to look a certain way. We can get curious about what might work for us. And these are just some tools to kind of practice exploring what that could look like. So thanks again for being here with me.